On this episode of Words of Wisdom, my guest is writer and broadcaster Spencer Leigh. Hello, Spencer.
Hello, good to speak to you.
Excellent. I've been looking forward to speak to you for quite a while now. And today we will be discussing the impact of the early US rock and rollers on the Beatles. Spencer is not only an acclaimed chronicler of the Beatles, but has also published books on Little Richard, Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley, as well as the story of doo-wop. So Spencer is ideally qualified to discuss today's subject. So just to set the background, was it fair to say that for most Brits in the 1950s, their first and sometimes only contact with rock and roll was mainly via anodyne cover versions by British stars of the day?
Well, I suppose so. I mean, if you want me to speak from my own point of view, I was born in 1945 and rock and roll came along 1955, 1956. I can remember early in 1956 seeing the charts and there was this name, Elvis Presley, in it. And I thought, gosh, there's somebody called Elvis Presley. What a fantastic name. And I had no idea what Heartbreak Hotel sounded like at all. And I wanted to hear it, but I was too young to go into a record shop and ask to hear it in one of the booths. You had to be 16 for that.
Yep.
So, and the BBC wasn't playing it. And I remember being in bed with a cold and off school. And there was a morning program on called Housewife's Choice, which was a program to do your housework to, believe it or not, Housewife's Choice. And during the course of this program, they played some rock and roll, and I thought that's good. And then straight after Housewife's Choice, they had a minister on who also played some rock and roll, and this was Heartbreak Hotel by Elvis Presley. And he said, I've just heard the most abominable, appalling record I have ever heard. You know, this is the end of civilization as we know it. I'm making all this up, of course, but that's what he thought. And he said, listen to this record, it is terrible. And he put on about a minute of it, you see, and then he said, I told you it was terrible, didn't I? Well, I was instantly cured. I put my clothes on, went straight out and bought the record, and haven't looked back since. I mean, popular music, I thought was great in the 50s. These records were just so magnificent. And of course, they set the bar high. When you've got Elvis Presley, when you've got Little Richard, when you've got Chuck Berry, bringing out new records and bringing out what we now know are classic records, the other people have to be good to keep up. And that was the same in the Merseybeat era as well. The other Merseybeat groups, the other groups in the UK had to be good to keep up with the Beatles. Otherwise, you didn't stand a chance. So I think that was really important.
For sure. And it was The Girl Can't Help It, the 1956 film. Was that the first visual touch paper that lit the Beatles? The first time they actually saw Little Richard, Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent play?
Yeah, well, yes, in a way. I mean, there had been rock and roll films before that. Bill Haley and his Comets appeared in Rock Around the Clock and Don't Knock the Rock, and Little Richard was in Don't Knock the Rock. But Bill Haley himself looked like, well, he was a scoutmaster of rock and roll, really. He looked like someone who was, he was 33, 34, so he looked like someone who was older anyway, and he didn't look like teen idol material at all. So that although the music was still great, I mean, I loved Rock Around the Clock and Don't Knock the Rock, it was more like an extension of dance band music. It wasn't really rebellious teenage music. And then you have, well, there was a film in 1956 called It Came from Outer Space, and that's where these characters seem to come from. People who wouldn't have made it in 1,000 years before rock and roll. People like Gene Vincent, marvelous character. I mean, I saw Gene Vincent a few times in the 60s, and he never looked at the audience. He was looking at some vision up in the sky. And really strange guy, dressed in black leathers, of course. You never saw anybody else dressed in black leathers like that. And singing in this high-pitched voice, singing something like, Bebopalula, she's the girl in the red blue jeans. What are red blue jeans, you know? And she only has to walk around the store, as the song says, and people are going mad for her. So it was a fantastic song, a nonsense song, really, but it was great. And then Little Richard, you know, I mean, his songs hardly contain stories. I mean, Tutti Frutti or Bop Bopaloo Bopalop Bam Boom and things like that. Fantastically exciting, but not really songwriting as it had been sort of in the previous decades. This was just an expression of joy, and it just sounded wonderful. And so you had all these marvelous records coming along, and I just loved them. And people in Liverpool were loving them too, and they were starting to make their own demonstration records, doing it in church halls and the like. And then 1962, the Beatles do Love Me Do in October 62. And then that sort of opened the floodgates, as it were. And then you had a real challenge to the Americans.
And of course, Little Richard was a huge influence to the Beatles. I think they added Long Tall Sally to their repertoire when they were still the Quarrymen in 1957, and he performed it right up until 1966.
Yeah, yes, and John Lennon was singing it first of all. I think he was singing it before Paul McCartney joined. So it'd be interesting to know the dynamics there when it switched from John Lennon doing it to Paul McCartney doing it. I mean, they both could do it very well, I should think. And Little Richard was someone that they met in 1962, both they met him in Birkenhead for a concert at the Tar Ballroom. Brown Epstein then booked Little Richard for a show at the Liverpool Empire where they were going to introduce a single, Love Me Do. And then they actually found themselves the next week in Hamburg with him, and Hamburg was a place where people could behave as outrageously as they liked, and everybody else loved it. So it was a perfect place for sort of nutcase performers, you know, like Gene Vincent, like Little Richard and the like, because they could be as wild as they liked over there. And so it was a great learning curve for the Beatles to know these people. And I mean, I know the fondness where in recent months, in fact, when I've spoken to the Searchers, you know, how they love meeting the big American rock and roll stars over at the Star Club in Hamburg.
There's that great photograph of the Beatles with Little Richard backstage, and it looks like they're having an audience with the King, doesn't it?
Well, indeed,
and the Queen.
Yeah. yes, and also the Chants were there as well. There in some of the pictures too, which was the key black group in Liverpool, and they would come on stage without instruments and do Duke of Earl, you know, and that would be really good.
Was that Eddie Abu who went on to form The Real Thing later on? Was it?
Eddie Abu, yes, and his brother Chris, who was younger than him, they went into The Real Thing, and then they had a succession of hits, and they made a wonderful album called 4 from 8, which was 4 lads, The Real Thing, from 8, Liverpool 8, and the songs are about Stanhope Street and the area of Liverpool 8, and I think that's a marvelous album, in fact. They're a great group, The Real Thing, I think. But it's the black influence that you've got there that's in the Beatles, that's in all those groups, you know, they were copying the black artists and things. I mean, I don't think there was the color bar that you often see now, you know. We didn't care where our music came from, in fact. There was nothing racial at all, really.
Yeah, and you can see a direct line between Little Richard and She Loves You, I think, in the sort of falsetto sections of the song where they're going, woo.
Yeah, well, a lot of other people were doing that sort of thing too. I mean, the Isley Brothers, Twist and Shout, you know, you got a lot of woos and things in that. But certainly being close to Little Richard enabled them to sort of copy him. I mean, one of the things about Little Richard, and I think it comes out in the book, is that a lot is made by writers of Little Richard's first records, Tutti Frutti and Long Tall Sally, coming out in the States, and Pat Boone recording bland covers of them, and in fact changing the lyrics slightly as well to make them perhaps more acceptable to Middle America, as it were. And Pat Boone had the hits in America with them, although Little Richard then went into the charts as well. And Little Richard, I think, found that Pat Boone had actually done him a favor because he'd introduced these songs to America, and that gave him a sort of springboard. But he always knew that Pat Boone had done them badly. It was never a racial thing with Little Richard. I mean, a lot of books say it is that he didn't like white people doing his songs. And that's untrue because he loved Elvis Presley doing his songs. He just didn't like people doing his songs badly. And that's what Pat Boone was doing. So that's not a racial thing. That's an aesthetic thing, really. He's saying Pat Boone wasn't doing them well enough, and he wasn't, and Pat Boone was making a mess of them. But Elvis did them fine, and Little Richard thought that Paul McCartney did Long Tall Sally excellently too.
Absolutely, and Paul paid a great tribute to Little Richard in 2020. Got the quote here: "I owe a lot of what I do to Little Richard and his style, and he knew it. He would say, I taught Paul everything he knows, and I had to admit he was right."
Yes, well, not everything, because there's so many other influences in McCartney, of course. I mean, that is one of the good things about the Beatles. They were sponges. They took influences from all over the place. And they were lucky because they had all this around them. Everything that was happening around them was, they could take that in. Whereas, because of all these other groups, there was so much happening on the radio. There were live shows. Americans were coming over here to tour. I mean, I think one of the most important things that happened on Merseybeat is Buddy Holly playing the Philharmonic Hall in Liverpool in March 1958, because he came over with a Fender Stratocaster. And because of the war, American instruments were banned here. You couldn't buy them in the shops. You couldn't get a Fender Stratocaster. And they saw Buddy Holly with a Fender Stratocaster, and these people thought, what's this? We must have an instrument like this. And so people wanted Fender Strats then. And the import ban was lifted a year or so later anyway, so they were able to get them. But prior to Buddy Holly, you know, they hadn't had instruments like that, and they were using British instruments like Burns and the like. So Buddy Holly is tremendously influential, and it always amuses me that going to the Philharmonic Hall, you walk up, do you know Liverpool?
Yes, I've been there.
Yeah. Well, you'll know that you walk up a hill to get to the Philharmonic Hall, and then there's Hoop Street where the two cathedrals are, and that's where the Philharmonic Hall is. And so it's almost like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, walking up the hill. They see Little Richard and they come down, walking up the hill, going to the Philharmonic Hall, seeing Buddy Holly with his Fender Stratocaster, and then walking down again. And these musicians have been transformed. They want an instrument like that. They want to be like that. So that concert is immensely important, in fact.
You've missed out an important step on the journey, because I'm sure that before and after they would have stopped off at the Phil, the pub opposite the.
Well, they probably
to be anointed.
And that's where McCartney did a live show only a couple of years ago. That program with Jamie Corden. Yes, I mean, the Philharmonic pub was one of the great watering holes, in fact. And in fact, along Hope Street, you've also got the Art College, which is where John Lennon was. And you've actually got Liverpool Institute, too. That's only just down the side road, Mount Street. So it's all around that area. So much was happening there. And in the mid-1960s, Liverpool 8, which after the riots was called Toxteth, the area, although no one called it that then. Around that time, you had all the arts meeting together. You had the poets, you had the writers, you had the musicians, the artists, everyone all together. And I think that created a marvelous melting pot. In a way, I suppose, similar to what was happening in Paris, because so many of the performers there, like Jacques Brel, Serge Gainsbourg, sort of mixed up with the artists and the writers in Paris and created something very different. You haven't got that as much in Liverpool, but there's certainly an element of it there. And of course, Scaffold with Roger McGough comes out of that area too.
Much is made of the musical influences of the early rockers on the Beatles, but what about the performance style that the Beatles adopted, both in Hamburg and later on? How much of that comes from the original early rockers?
Oh, I think seeing them on film, seeing what they were like. Again, they didn't appear on, these rockers didn't appear much on television, but you could go and see them at the cinema. And as you mentioned, The Girl Can't Help It was a tremendously influential film. You saw Eddie Cochran with his shoulders doing 20 Flight Rock. You had Little Richard doing Bebop-A-Lula in it. You had Gene Vincent doing Bebop-A-Lula in it. You had Little Richard in there with a song for Jane Mansfield, The Girl Can't Help It. So it was a staggeringly good film, and people wanted to rock and roll like that. It seemed uninhibited. It seemed to be fun. It just seemed to be great. And so that was a tremendous influence, certainly. And you had people, well, I mean, someone like King Size Taylor, who was a 20-stone butcher's boy, 6'3", 6'4", a real tough guy. I mean, he was never going to be a pin-up or anything, couldn't possibly be. But I mean, he got that sound and he got it down really, really well, I think. In fact, in June 1958, before they were the Beatles were the Quarrymen, and they recorded at Percy Phillips's studio in Liverpool, and they made In Spite of All the Danger and That'll Be the Day, Buddy Holly song, you know, shortly after Buddy Holly had been in Liverpool. And they made their single there with Percy Phillips. At exactly the same time, in Crosby, which is 7 miles away, King Size Taylor and the Dominoes were being recorded by Bernard Whitty. King Size, this butcher's boy, was only 18 at the time. He does, well, for example, he does Little Richard's Good Golly Miss Molly, and he does it ferociously. I think King Size Taylor and the Dominoes then were sounding much more exciting than the Beatles did, or the Quarrymen at that time. And it just shows you how much talent there was in the city. And indeed, just before the Quarrymen went to Percy Phillips's studio, only about 10 days earlier, Ronnie Wycherley had been in there because, beg your pardon, Ronnie Wycherley had been in there because Larry Parnes wanted him to make a demo of his songs so he could see what he was like. And he recorded a demo and put them down, put 6 songs in 6 minutes down on a 2-sided single. And his mother sent them off to Larry Parnes with a photograph of what her son, Ronnie Wycherley, looked like. Larry Parnes thought, this guy looks good, and he became Billy Fury. So all that's happening at the same time in 1958.
I've done a quick inventory of the Beatles' recorded output, including the anthologies and live at the BBC. And they actually officially recorded 5 Little Richard songs, but they actually did 9 Chuck Berry songs. So let's move on to Chuck Berry, because equally influential, I think, to the Beatles.
Yeah, well, the reason they did 5 of his and 9 of Chuck Berry, I suppose, is that Chuck Berry wrote a lot more songs than Little Richard did. And also, the Beatles did quite a few Larry Williams songs. And Larry Williams really was Little Richard light. Little Richard, in end of 1957, decided he wanted to go into the ministry. And Speciality Records, who were putting Little Richard out, wanted to continue in the Little Richard vein. So they got hold of Larry Williams, and he sang exactly like Little Richard, not as well, but pretty well, and wrote some good songs. And he did Dizzy Miss Lizzie and Slow Down and the like, which are songs that the Beatles did. So if you combine Larry Williams's songs together with Little Richard's songs and say how many of those did the Beatles do, you probably, I think you'd be more than the 9 with Chuck Berry.
Carl Perkins also figures quite highly. They did 6 of Carl's, but John did 4 solo recordings of Carl Perkins' songs. So it wasn't just George that had a fondness for Carl Perkins. It seems it was equally spread.
No, but George really liked Carl Perkins' guitar playing, and that's an influence in a lot of the Beatles recordings and a lot of what he did himself. Yeah. George was very keen on other guitarists. In fact, quite early on, he was quite into Django Reinhardt, although the Django Reinhardt influence doesn't come through in the Beatles recordings.
And you've also got the Coasters figuring quite highly. There's 3 Coasters tracks, I think, all written by Lieber and Stoller, that the Beatles covered. Obviously, 2 of them in the Decca sessions.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the Beatles did say at one. John Lennon did say at one stage. I think that when the bubble bursts on the Beatles, we'll become songwriters. We want to be like the Brill Building songwriters, and they loved Goffin and King and Pomus and Schumann and the like. So they loved those songs. And in fact, Doc Pomus's daughter told me that she was once in a store in New York, and John and Yoko were in there. And she saw John was there, and so she could say hello to him. She said, "Hello, you don't know me, but I'm Doc Pomus's daughter." And John in the shop went through the whole of Save the Last Dance for Me.
Wow. And his jukebox is quite enlightening as well. The records on John Lennon's jukebox, there was obviously been a lot published about that a few years back.
Well, yeah, I'm never quite sure about that jukebox, though, because Tony Barrow, who was the Beatles press officer, said he never saw it. So how come, if he was a Beatles press officer and knocking around with the Beatles most of the time,
right.
So John Lennon may have had this jukebox, but whether he actually used it much or not, I don't actually know.
Right. Okay. So a bit of commercial creativity, maybe.
Yeah. And when they put the record out of John Lennon's jukebox, I think they put a version on it of some other guy from the Big Three, which was the one they remade in the early 70s. And I certainly don't think John Lennon would have put that version of some of the, well, he couldn't have put it on his jukebox in 1964-65, which is what they were saying.
I always think, I'm not a great fan of compilations, but I always think that EMI missed a trick in the 70s when they started repackaging the Beatles. The rock and roll music but was crying out for an album of all the cover versions that they'd done, all the great rock and roll songs, but it tended to be a mishmash, that particular era.
I suppose so. It didn't really bother me if I got the tracks anyway. I was quite happy. Although I do remember meeting Bill Kenwright. This must be about 10 years ago now, because it was when people were still buying CDs. And Bill Kenwright was chairman of Everton. And I just bumped into him and he said, "Oh, Spencer, take a look at this." And he pulled out of his pocket a new CD of the Everly Brothers. And he said, "Isn't that great?" And I said, "Yes." I said, "But Bill, why have you bought this? You've got all these tracks already." And he said, "Yes, but not in this order." That's one way of looking at it, but I tend to look at it, if I've got the track, that's happy. I'm happy.
Well, of course, with the advent of streaming now, we all make our own compilations, and including countless compilations of the last ever Beatles albums, imagining that Abbey Road wasn't the final thing that they recorded together.
Yeah, well, I don't like these what ifs. If I mean, I do it on occasions if I get an idea for an article, but on the whole, reality is quite exciting enough for me.
Yes, and I mean, they wouldn't have made those solo records if they were all together. It would have been very different. You can't imagine Paul doing Mother or Isolation, or it just wouldn't have worked, would it?
Yeah, but on the other hand, he did Let Me Roll It, where he sounds just like John Lennon. They could impersonate each other if they wanted to. They could do everything, really.
And
but,
although the Beatles,
just the point you're making, and I think you make a good one, though, is that in 1970, when the Beatles broke up, there were no groups at the time. I'm talking off the top of my head here because I haven't checked it out, but I think I'm right. There were no groups at the time, no acts that said we're going to break up and come back together. Simon and Garfunkel said, "That's it, we're finished." Of course, they did come back together, but they didn't plan to. And I think that is what happened to groups back then. Nowadays, of course, a group makes a record and says, "Right, we'll take the next couple of years off and then see what we'll do in a couple of years' time." So it's a different attitude now. And I don't think the Beatles thought, which is what a group would do now, let's go off and make our solo albums and we'll come back in 2 or 3 years' time. That's what would happen now, but it didn't happen then.
I'm rather glad they didn't, because they went out at the top, and we've got some fantastic solo albums from all four of them in the end, which we wouldn't have otherwise had. So, but you can't reinvent history, can you?
Not really. I mean, they if they got back together again, I think they'd have done very good things. I mean, they were just exceptional musicians. But I suppose too that if you're a very creative band, you go off in different directions after a while because you're creative. You're all together at first, and then you have your success, and then you want to do different things. And there aren't many groups that actually stay together who are really creative. I mean, an example in Liverpool, I suppose, is a group like the Spinners that starts off in 1958 and just goes all the way through till the time they finished. But they were still making the same type of records at the end that they were doing at the beginning. They weren't planning to go musically forward. In fact, I said to Huey Jones once about how did they work out harmonies and something, and he said, "Harmonies, we just sang," you know. So it was a different attitude. Whereas with a lot of the groups, they went on to different things, and other people wanted to follow them or they didn't. I mean, the Beatles left all the Liverpool groups behind, I suppose, 1966, 1967, when they embraced the psychedelic movement at the time. I mean, psychedelic might have been seen as a silly diversion, you know, and those records might have meant nothing a year later, but it didn't, you know, and it really separated them from the rest of the groups, because groups like Jerry and the Pacemakers and the Searchers, they just wanted a pint after their shows. There was no question of drugs with them because they weren't interested in it. But of course, the Beatles, that's another thing about the Beatles, I suppose. They embraced anything that was new. If something came along, they thought, we'll try it.
Well, you're right. And they embraced so many influences: Motown, classical, jazz, avant-garde, you name it. But their abiding love was for the early rock and roll. So just to wrap up this episode, what do you think is the single biggest contribution that the American rock and roll stars made to the Beatles and their legacy?
Well, just by being there, because they wouldn't have been the same without that impetus, without that music coming from America. You know, the first Quarrymen performance in 1957, they were meant to be a skiffle group, so doing the music of Lonnie Donegan, the old folk songs and the like. And although they were doing things along those lines, in particular Lost John, which I presume because of the title, John Lennon liked a great deal, and he liked the leadbelly songs like Rock Island Line. In fact, it's interesting that in the Beatles Museum in Liverpool, you can see John Lennon's original copy of Lonnie Donegan's Rock Island Line. And you know those hard shellac singles, you had to put them on the turntable. Well, if you didn't put them on and you didn't put them on quite right, it'd chip away at the center, wouldn't it, of the hole in the center. And so you can see the hole in the center, how it has been chipped away. And that shows to me, one, that John Lennon didn't particularly care when he plopped the record down. He didn't take much care. But also that he really loved the record, that he was playing it so much that he damaged the center of it. I mean, I had a lot of 78s, but I never damaged the center in the way that John Lennon has on that record. So I think that just seeing that record is very, very telling. It tells you how much he loved the record. But he also loved the rock and roll music that was coming from America and the unusual songs that were coming. But in those days, people couldn't afford these records, or couldn't afford very many of them. And so what actually happened was they could go into a record shop and hear them, and they'd scribble down the chords and the lyrics and then do them as best they could. And when it came to the Quarrymen performing in 1957 at that church fete, they did Come Go With Me. And John Lennon adds a verse about come down to the penitentiary, which is a wonderful word to put in there, 5-syllable American word, you know, that we never used in this country, and it fits into the lyric perfectly. So it shows that he was rewriting songs at an early age, and he was just messing about with them and having a great deal of fun. But he loved those songs, and he was doing that rock and roll. And then Paul comes along and says, well, I know the words of 20 Flight Rock and I can play the chords of this. And John Lennon sees a fellow soul there, somebody who's doing the sort of things that he wants to do. And so they get together, and that's that. Sorry, what was your question at the
It was just wrapping things up, Spencer, and just said the single biggest contribution that the US rock and rollers gave.
Well, that's what they made. You know, it turned them on. It turned John, Paul, and George on. You know, that's the really important thing.
Perfectly put. Spencer, thank you very much for sharing your insights and memories today. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.